Welcome to another episode of Practical Organic Living. In our previous videos on roasting coffee beans at home, we suggested a few reasons why you would consider roasting coffee at home, how to use a BocaBoca coffee roaster, and how to use a Behmor coffee roaster. In today's episode, we're going to compare the Behmor roaster against the BocaBoca roaster, and we're also going to show you the results of roasting the coffee using a Behmor coffee roaster versus a BocaBoca roaster. So now we're ready to go outside to roast our coffee beans.
So as you can see, the main difference between the Behmor and the Boca Boca is the size. So the Behmor is a lot wider than the Boca Boca as example, and it's a lot heavier. So what we're gonna do now is roast a quarter pound of coffee. So I've got two bags here. We're gonna roast one for the Behmor and one for the Boca Boca. So what I'm gonna do now is pour the coffee beans into the roaster and we'll get started roasting. Now we press P1 because this is a hard coffee bean because it's grown at a very high elevation. The coffee description says it's grown I think around 2,000 meters above sea level, so that's considered pretty high altitude. This profile is going to roast for 8.5 minutes. I expect the Behmor to take a little bit more time than the Boca Boca to roast. And also the Behmor can actually roast up to a pound of coffee at a time, whereas for the Boca Boca, they recommend that you don't roast over half a pound. So the timer started and you've got to press start. So that's one difference between the Boca Boca and the Behmor, because for the Behmor, you've got to press the start button again once it's 75% done. Otherwise, the coffee roaster is not going to complete the roasting cycle. Whereas with the Boca Boca, you can pretty much stop whenever you want. And I'll show you how we determine when to stop. Another thing you'll notice for this particular coffee roaster is that there's no smoke coming out of the roaster. Now, this is a good time to let you hear the crackling. So this is going through the first crack. Now this came at a pretty good time because first crack is happening around the 1 minute mark, which is perfect because we want the beans to stop roasting after 1 minute. All right, so there's 5 more seconds left in the roast. And after it hits 0, I'm going to open the door to let it cool faster. The one thing about opening the door is that there's gonna be a lot of shaft. So for this particular roaster, the shaft is not contained inside the coffee drum. Whereas with the Boca Boca, all the shaft is in the roasting drum itself. So when you pour it out, you'll see the shaft and the coffee beans in the same place. Whereas with this particular roaster, the shaft tends to separate from the drum and it collects down in the shaft collector. And that makes cleaning a little bit more messy. But for some people, it might be preferable because it's easier to separate the shaft from the coffee beans. So while the Behmor coffee roaster is cooling down, we're gonna start roasting coffee in our Boca Boca roaster. So the first thing you wanna do with this roaster is to actually preheat it. So there is a on and off switch in the back, which I'm gonna press right now. So after you turn it on, you want to turn the heat level, power to maximum, and to start the timer. You want to heat this to about 250 before you pour the beans in. So that should take no more than 1 minute. So one thing you'll see is that the Boca Boca roasts the coffee in a more open environment, meaning it's not closed. So therefore, you have a lot less control over the humidity and the temperature of the environment outside of the coffee beans. So this is done preheating. So what I'm gonna do is momentarily turn this off, take the drum out, put the cover here, and then pour the coffee beans into the drum. You wanna quickly put the cover back on, insert it back in, turn the unit back on, and increase the timer again back to, say, 10 minutes for now. And because this is a hard coffee bean, you want to actually turn the heat level all the way to max in the beginning. So one thing you'll notice immediately is that you can actually see the coffee beans in the drum itself, whereas with the Behmor roaster, you can't actually see it even with the lights on. What I like to do is actually put this cover on because it helps insulate the heat a little bit better. This cover has a little opening, it's got a little slit, so you can see the color of the coffee beans as it's roasting. Another difference between these two roasters is that you can actually smell the coffee beans, because with this roaster, the Behmor roaster, it does such a good job suppressing the smoke and aromas that you can't really smell when the coffee is done. Another thing is that you can actually see the smoke later on when the coffee is almost done roasting. That's when you know the coffee is done, because it usually happens before the first crack. And the first crack is, like I said before, when we usually stop roasting the coffee. We'll let this roast for a little bit and we'll bring it back when the coffee has started the first crack. All right, so the coffee is done roasting. So I'm gonna take the shaft, collector out. I'm gonna take the coffee out. And as you can see, the coffee is done roasting and the roast seems to be pretty uniform. So what I'm gonna do now is pour it into our coffee bag. So this has reached first crack and there's a lot of smoke coming out, so we know it's done. So I'm gonna take this out and pour it into the cooler. So as you can see, the shaft has collected along with the coffee beans in here. Another difference between these two roasters is that the cooling functions are separated. You can cool this outside the roasting. So if you want to roast more coffee, you can keep roasting and you could cool the coffee beans somewhere else. So what I like to do is stir the coffee beans in the shaft so that the shaft falls in the bottom. When you take the tray out like this, you can see that the coffee shaft is collecting in here. So one of the differences between the two roasters is that it takes a little bit more time to actually separate all the shaft from the coffee beans, whereas with the Behmor roaster, the shaft is already collected at the bottom. So as you can see, the evenness of the roast doesn't look as even on the Boca Boca from what I can see, because you can see there's a lot of beans that are a lot lighter than other beans. For example, this bean and this bean. There's a huge difference in the colors. And that's because when you roast the coffee beans actually expand. So when we poured the beans into the coffee drum in here, it expanded so that it was actually very hard for the air to circulate around the beans. When it's hard for the air to circulate around the beans and there's not a lot of space for the beans to move around, you get an uneven roast. So that's one of the disadvantages of using the Boca Boca. And that's because if you want to roast a large amount of beans, you're not going to get a good roast. So what I'm going to do is stop the bean cooler and pour this into the bag, into our bag. So this is the result of our two roasts. This is from the Behmor roaster and this is from the Boca Boca roaster. And we poured some coffee beans out for you to see. These coffee beans look a lot more evenly roasted than these coffee beans. You can see that there's a lot less shaft from the Behmor roaster, whereas for the Boca Boca roaster, there's still shaft. So some of these beans actually look a little green, even though they're not, because the shaft hasn't been fully separated. But nonetheless, the quality of the roast seems to be a lot better with the Behmor roaster as compared to the Boca Boca roaster.
So now it's been about a week since we roasted our coffee beans, and we're definitely ready to compare the results of these two roasters. Now let's grind and brew our coffee beans. So this is a cup of coffee roasted with the Behmor coffee roaster. And so this is another cup of coffee roasted using the Boca Boca roaster.
Yes.
So now we're ready to taste and tell you what it tastes like.
Let's smell it first. I think this one has a stronger smell.
Okay. So visually, the coffee looks about the same.
Okay. I think they taste about the same.
Okay, so I think that even though the Boca Boca did not roast the beans as evenly as the Behmor,
Yeah.
I don't think that's reflecting the results of the coffee when you taste it, because we think these taste pretty similar. So I think the bottom line is that using either roaster will produce a good cup of coffee. I think it's better than the coffee you'd get from a store. So that was our video on comparing two different coffee roasters, the Boca Boca and also the Behmor coffee roaster. We hope that these videos have inspired you to try roasting coffee at home.
Thank you everyone for watching, and we will see you next time. Bye.